Greetings, Pastor Ethan here again from Leroy Covenant Church. Well, today we are entering a very interesting part of the letter to Second Corinthians. In fact, this has been a very profound part of Corinthians for me, for my study, and for the effect it has had on me and what I've thought about as I've worked through this. And I hope it is for you as well. But these two chapters, there is a lot packed in, and I'm going to have to break it up into two videos, and I'm going to have to skip a lot because there's just so much here. But these two chapters, just to put it simply, have to do with this collection that Paul is gathering financial resources, is meaning the collection, for the poor and the destitute in Jerusalem. Now, according to the letter that he wrote to the church in Galatia, and he established the church in Galatia in his second missionary journey, so sometime in the latter 40s CE. And remember, now we're probably around 56, 57 CE, so almost 10 years has passed. But Paul probably started that collection back then. So this is a process and a thing that has gone on for probably close to about 10 years. Because if we go to Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, he says they all asked all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. So this idea that Paul remembered the poor was probably that he was making resources for it. So that is the assumption, and that this has been going on for a while, but has really been kicked into gear in these last few years. So Paul is writing this letter to the church in Corinth on his third missionary journey, but this is not the first letter he's written to them, or the second, or the third, most likely his fourth. And he, after spending time in Ephesus for a couple of years, goes up to Macedonia. And from Macedonia, he is penning this letter that he is going to give to Titus to take back to the church in Corinth. Now, we've worked through all this. We don't need to go back through. You can reference the other videos. But he is now going to address for 2 chapters this collection, trying to spur the church on there to rekindle collection efforts that had been started the first time around. So probably when he wrote First Corinthians about that time, because at the end of First Corinthians 16, he talks specifically about the collection, and he's telling them to basically set money aside and how it's going to work. So between First and Second Corinthians is, most people think, are about a year. So about a year has passed from when he first sent this message to spur the Corinthians on to start this movement, to gather it, and apparently it was going very well. But something happened between that first and second letter here that we know of as First and Second Corinthians, that something that stalled out, that it went totally flat. And it's probably because of these false missionaries or teachers that have made their way in that are really criticizing Paul to the people there, so much so that they're starting to waver. They don't see Paul as great of a leader or trustworthy as a leader as they used to, because they're hearing all these other voices that are criticizing him and saying that, he doesn't have really the right credentials. We do. Paul is deceptive. Paul is tricky. He's complicated. They're doing all of this. So for all that, this collection has stalled out, and word has gotten to Paul probably after Titus came back So Paul had that severe visit, right? He goes back to Ephesus, writes a severe letter. Titus brings it to them, and then he eventually is going to meet up with Titus in Macedonia. He gets Titus to come back and meet up with him. He hears what's happening here, and he hears some really good things, but it seems as if either because of Titus's word or the word of someone else, or how that all came about in the time frame, but somehow that Paul is needing to say, hey, we need to finish this. It is stalled out. But he's not going to really command them to do it. It's not going to be this harsh command, because he knows strategically that if he commands them, it's probably going to be pushed back. They're probably not going to want to hear it. So he's going to be very cautious and very smart and strategic in how he's going to word this, to write this letter to get them to start it back up. So that's kind of an overview of the section we are getting in today. Chapters 8 and 9 are tied together as a unit, but we just don't have enough time in this video to do both. So we're just going to look after chapter 8. And my apologies if we go a little fast or don't get in as depth. If you have questions, let me know. I'd love to answer them because I obviously have a lot more material here than we're going to be able to talk about. So just right before we begin, just ironic enough that Paul never uses the word money in these two chapters. He uses words like ministry, partnership, generous gift, this matter, this undertaking, bountiful gift, service, and the word grace, 10 times the noun for grace in the verbal form twice. So grace is a huge deal here, and it's not just grace as in money that you bless people with, but more into the spiritual part of your lives as a witness to Jesus Christ. So the first part of chapter 8, these first 6 sentences are tied kind of closely together. In the Greek New Testament, it is all one very, very long sentence before there's a period. But what Paul is going to do is open this to remind the Corinthians of their previous commitment to the funds that they need to reestablish. It's not something new. Okay, and then he's going to give them an example of what's happening in the churches in Macedonia where he is there now, and hopefully that is going to get them to get back on the bandwagon to do an amazing work. Because the churches where he is at in Corinth, in Macedonia, possibly Philippi, in those areas up there, they were heavily persecuted churches. They were very poor churches, and Paul was even arrested, and Silas were when he first went up there. So just kind of note that as Paul uses them as an example. So chapter 8, verse 1, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given to the Macedonian, or given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. Okay, so let's start off here. So brothers, he sets it off right away about his care and love for them. We want you, right, to know, to be aware of, even though this is not new information, but we want to remind you more or less about the grace of God, or this idea of how God's grace has already been given in the past and has already been doing things in the churches in Macedonia. Now, something to make or to do as a side note is Corinth and Macedonia were kind of long-time political rivals. And so the cities were going back and forth there. And so Paul has kind of used that. So when you hear these two, kind of think of that. But this grace comes from God, and it's doing an amazing work. So Paul says, in the midst of this severe or test or ordeal of affliction that is happening there, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty welled up into this rich generosity on their part, right? How did that happen? Like, that's a miracle. So they were extremely poor. The Greek term here is, you can translate it as basically rock bottom, dirt poor, right? And they were also probably very much persecuted. But somehow that welled up, right? Their overflowing joy and all of this, it welled up to the point that they were able to be incredibly generous. Like, that's incredible. Even in the midst of dirt poor poverty, they're able to do something. And so Paul, remember, is writing to the church in Corinth saying this, that, hey, if the really, really, really dirt poor churches in Macedonia are doing this, like wink, wink, maybe you should do too. The honor shame culture here, the rivalry culture in a little bit as well. And there was no middle class in the Mediterranean world at that time. You're either rich or poor. And it seems like the Corinthians were rather well off, the Macedonians not. And the people in Jerusalem, some of them not as well. For verse 3, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able. So a better translation here would be like according to their means. And even beyond their means, beyond their duty, way beyond it. Entirely on their own, Paul says, on their own accord. Verse 4, they urgently pleaded. They begged Paul. This was a privilege for them. With us for the privilege of sharing. That actually, the Greek word is grace, but it's an economic partnership. It is this fellowship, this privilege of sharing in the service to the Lord's people. This is quite different than the Corinthian church that was being divided by internal problems. Here, the dirt poor church that's persecuted and has nothing, they are begging Paul to do something for someone else. So it is incredible here. But what is the secret? What's the secret sauce to this? It's the one who is the main section here. Why did they give? It's theological. It's Jesus Christ, verse 5. And they exceeded our expectations or our hopes. They gave themselves, first of all, listen, to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God, or by the will of God also to us. Now, in Greek, there's no period here. This is, like we said, kind of a continuation of a sentence. But they gave themselves first to Jesus Christ. That's the secret sauce, right? That's why they're able to do it. Then they gave by the will of God to us. So Titus was successful during his last visit. Something happened here, right? And so they're trying to say, look, like the churches in Macedonia were able to do an amazing thing because they gave themselves to God. Now, let's think about you, and I'm going to bring up this guy named Titus that you know pretty well and that you trust, and I'm going to be very strategic in who I'm going to send here. So we urged or requested, it's the same word for comfort, which I think is cool because it probably brings them comfort to hear the word Titus or the name Titus. So we urged Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. That made a beginning phrase, that is a really tricky one to translate. And actually this word only shows up here in the whole New Testament, and then also not only that, but nowhere else in Greek literature. Like, this is a very, 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 very rare Greek word, but almost to the point that it means that whatever collection efforts started, like, they stopped and they need to be restarted. Okay? To bring to completion, to finish this act among you, right? The Corinthians want to grow in grace, so Paul will build on that, and he's going to list some of these virtues coming up here. Okay? So we get to verse 7. They excel in a lot of things, in speech and knowledge, in willingness and earnestness, and in love we have kindled in you, or our love for you, or the love we have for you. He's going to say that. Because of that, see to it, or see that you also excel. You excel at those other things? Excel in financial giving. Excel in generosity. In this grace. It is a grace. It is an act of grace of giving. So very interesting here. The NIV puts in the middle of this sentence the word see that you. It sounds like a command, like make sure that you do this. But there is no verb here in Greek. Scholars have inserted that word because they're doing an interpretive effort on your part to stick in kind of a command. But the question is that really a command? Because there is no imperative verb here. The only imperative verb that shows up in this entire chapter is verse 11. So it would be a better way to translate that as something like a wish. So when Paul says, but since you excel in faith, in speech, and knowledge, and complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled for you, you could say, I hope or I wish that you would also, it's my hope that you would also excel in this. Now, he really, really wants him to do it, but it's a little bit said a little bit differently, okay? So kind of keep that in mind. And some of the insights I've gotten from this, from various commentaries as well, but just as a quick plug, this book, Paul and Money, by Verlin Verbrugge and Keith Krell, a very, very good resource if you want to know more about this. But that's the same thing in verse 7 here that's going to show up in other verses as well, that they're kind of some of the scholars for these translations are putting in these imperatives that where they're really not there. But we're thinking that it's more of kind of this wish language, a little less. So anyway, Paul has this invitation. Are they going to take Paul's advice or not? He wants it to be a free, open response. So Paul says straight up, I'm not commanding you. As an apostle, I didn't receive this from Jesus Christ, but I want to test you. I want to see if you really love Jesus. I want to test the sincerity of your love, right? By comparing it with the earnestness of others to see if it's genuine, right? And now, if that hasn't changed their mind, if that hasn't made them feel a little bit convicted, ultimate example of generosity, ultimate example of volunteering yourself for others, the ultimate persuasive peace, Jesus Christ. Verse 9, for you know, Corinthians, the grace of God, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. Or so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Jesus, who was in the heavenlies, in glory, decided beforehand, free will decision, to come down and lay all of that aside, to become poor, to become human, to give up the glories of heaven, so that you might become rich, so that you might experience the riches of salvation. Jesus gave his life for the sake and needs of others. So to give to the poor would be a concrete example and measure of how they love Jesus in return. See how this is so beautiful? Verse 10, Paul says, and here is my judgment in NIV. I'd rather put in opinion, because remember, we're kind of straying away from that command language. Here's my opinion about what's best for you or what benefits you, what's useful for you. So the NIV translates this, even though it's a little bit more hard in Greek. Last year, you were the first, not only to give, but you also had the desire to do so. You had this, like Corinthians, what happened? You had this desire. You were the first ones to actually have it. You predated the Macedonians in your desire to give and this really kind of renewed work. But it's died. You need to bring it to completion, right? So he's commending them, but it's kind of, this is like what's left over. So now in verse 11, we finally get the first and only imperative. Now finish. The word finish, that is the imperative. The work. So that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it. So you wanted to do it so that can match it according to your means. Now, very interesting. So this is it's what you can afford. It'd be seen as proportionally what's right for you. Now, we could get into this whole debate about tithing and different percentages, but just to say the New Testament really is silent on the matter as far as what actual percentage. But what can you afford? Proportionately, what's right for you with how much you have. Do that in the sight of God and be generous. If we learn anything from this passage, be generous. And it's going to be for equity, so that people are equal, right? Doesn't mean you have to become poor so that you can help someone else, but do it so that people are okay. So he says, verses 12 and 13, for if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what you don't have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved and you're hard pressed and you're dirt poor, but that there might be fairness, there might be equity. That's the issue here. So, and then Paul's going to bring us up to this manner in verses 14 through 15 about manna in the desert with the Israelites. He's going to say here that the one who had gathered much didn't have too much, and the one who gathered little didn't have too little. It's about proportions, right? But he's saying at the present time, hey, you have physical resources. And you have spiritual resources. Give it to people who don't so that they can bless you back. But specifically, God is meeting the needs, spiritual needs of the Corinthians so that they can help meet the physical needs of those in Jerusalem, right? And so now Paul is going to bring into a new unit, verses 16 through 24. Not that it's a new topic, but kind of just a new unit. And he's going to commend Titus, kind of like he commended himself earlier in the book. But to say like, look, we're going to do this with integrity, and here's how we're going to do it. Thanks be to God who put in the heart of Titus to have the same concern for you I did. We have the same concern, Paul is saying. For Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm and on his own initiative. He thought of it, right? And we're on the same page. That's pretty much what Paul is saying. And we are sending along with him a brother who is praised or approved, recognized by all the churches for his service of the gospel, right? So we're also going to send someone else. And then Paul's going to go on in a few verses to say we're sending a third. So it's going to be Titus, this brother that he's talking about and another one, and they're going to serve as representatives of the churches in Macedonia, and they're godly men. So there will be integrity in this collection, integrity in this offering, and they are going before Paul goes. Okay, that's very important to hear. They're going before Paul goes. He's not handling the money. They are. And he's going to build that up as well. So no one can question what he's doing here. So verse 19, what is more, he was chosen by the churches to accompany, to travel with us as we carry the offering, which is in this grace we administer in order to honor the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. So that's why we're doing it, to honor God, and to show our willingness to help those who are poor. That's how we should always do everything, right? Verse 20, we want to avoid any criticism, any blame, or anything. It's a rare Greek word, but any blame on our part of the way we administer this gift. Not just any gift, but a liberal, abundant, generous gift. It wasn't small, which is amazing, right? And how they're going to deliver this. So we are taking pains, Paul is saying, to do what is right, to do what is good, to do what is honorable, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but in the eyes of men. There again, too, that should define everything we do. So now he's going to send another brother who he says in verse 22 has often proved or has been tested, approved to us in many ways that he is zealous and not even and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. That, hey, you're going to do it. Paul's been boasting about them. They're confident in you. They're going to serve as representatives, and they're going to go with Titus in this journey. So he says in verse 23, as for Titus, look at it. I mean, Titus is not an apostle. What Paul says, he's my partner. He's my co-worker. Really? That's pretty cool. I love Titus. And when Titus shows up, they're going to be like, man, Titus, the guy who came, we trust him, we know him, and now Paul speaks greatly of him. So our co-worker among you, as for the brothers, they are representatives of the churches, and they are an honor to Christ. They themselves are an honor to Christ. I don't know offhand any other people in the New Testament that it's spoken of like that. These men were a blessing to God and their faith, and so they are selling. Paul is going to send this 3-man delegation ahead of him to finish this completion of the offering of this collection, so that there's no questions asked, right? There's no weird motives going on, that they can trust in him and that this is going to happen. Because if he doesn't, there's going to be or if they don't, there's going to be embarrassment, right? The Corinthians have to step up here. So finally, Paul ends this chapter by saying, therefore, show or exhibit, give these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. Paul knows that at the heart, the Corinthians have this heart, right? They have these good intentions. They've repented. They are believers, but there are some struggles. There are some things that still need to be worked out. And Paul has confidence in them, but he's also kind of, confidence, but also just really, really, really hoping that what he has heard is true, right? Because if not, things are not going to go well for Paul, for the delegation that's going, for the church in Corinth, for everybody. It doesn't look good. So Paul is calling them to complete this collection that you started. You had the idea. Now, if you want an example, look at the churches in Macedonia. You can do it. Step up to the plate, and if you do it, God is going to bless you with the gifts that you are giving to bless other people, right? So incredible chapters here, so much information. Like I said, if you have questions, post them. I'd love to talk more about it. But man, may everything we do, may we put God first in everything. And may everything be right and good and moral in the sight of God and the sight of each other for his glory. In Jesus' name, amen.